Hi, my name is David Kong and welcome to this tutorial on video export settings, focusing on Adobe Media Encoder because that's what Premiere Pro and After Effects use now. And as you can see, I'm using Media Encoder CC 2014, which is the most current version as I'm recording this in December of 2014. Now, this is sort of the second video in a series. The first one was all about the understanding how codecs work, what principles they use, how they manage to squish a large video into a small file, and what those techniques, how those techniques actually work. And I go into enough detail that you should be able to understand everything you need to know about how to use codecs, how to choose which codec to use when, that sort of a thing. Now we're going to go a little bit more practical, and I'll show you, I'm going to walk you through all the export settings in Media Encoder, and I'll explain what they mean and when you might use one in one way or another. All right, so as you can see, I've got Media Encoder up here, and I've got a video here I'm ready to export. There's some nice presets right here, but those presets are also available in the main interface, which I'm going to go to by clicking here. Okay, so this is my video, and here are all my settings here. Let's start at the top here. So format. This is just what codec you're using or what file type you're creating. There are many options here, but I'm going to focus on H.264 because that's by far the most common codec that's used nowadays. It's one of the most efficient codecs, and it's great for web video and for just giving to a client, just handing them a file because it's quite small files you're dealing with. I'm using that most of the time. I often use DNx HD. And I'm on a PC right now. If I were on a Mac, you would see QuickTime ProRes, and but right now I'm on a PC, so that's not an option. So I'm just going to choose H.264 here. And if you want to know more about when you use H.264 versus DNx HD or ProRes, how all that works, how to make that decision, take a look at my other video, Understanding Codecs, because I go through all of that there. And it's too much to explain in just a couple of seconds right here. And then one of the nice things about, say, DNx HD and ProRes is that there are really no settings to worry about. All you have to do is pick the right version, and you don't have to worry about tweaking options like you do in H.264. And you can see, first of all, it starts out with a lot of presets, millions of presets here. And these are handy, though, to be honest, I've never used almost I've never used most of them. The main ones I use now are the ones at the bottom here: Vimeo, YouTube. Sorry, it's kind of going below my screen capture here, but down below there's a bunch of YouTube presets too. And these are great to start with, especially if you, like, say you know you're going to Vimeo, start with a Vimeo preset, and then tweak the settings after that. Okay, so first thing to look at here is this little summary panel right here. This is really handy. Okay, so if I look here in the source, you can see I've got a clip, which means I'm not, instead of exporting from a timeline, Premiere, I'm just exporting a clip. And this information tells me what the settings are for that clip. And this is really important because you want to match these settings. You want the source and the output to match. Now there will be more options in the output, or more information in the output, but everything you see in the source should appear in the output, like 1920 by 1080. I should see that. Oh, look, I've got a problem right here. See, I see 1280 by 720. That means I'm not giving the highest quality. I'm downsizing. Now, sometimes you may want to downsize your video deliberately, but make sure if there's any value in here that's not the same as the one down here, you should have a reason for that. Okay, now I'm going to jump through these tabs real quick because we'll spend most of the time in video. I'm just going to jump through the effects tabs. You can generally ignore most of these here unless you're applying a lot, if you're doing some fancy color correction. The only one I really regularly use is name overlay. And see, this puts a name, and I actually don't use the source file name. I go to prefix and suffix only, which means it's going to just show the prefix and the suffix. And I will use this because, say, I'm going to do a temporary edit for review. So I'll say temp for review. And I'll usually put it in the bottom right so it's a little bit out of the way. And I do this because sometimes I'll give a client several different versions at different times. I might do, I get them one to review and they give me comments and I change it. And they might end up with a bunch of files, and sometimes the client ends up uploading the wrong file when they're done. So this way, if I ever give them a version that's not final, I put that burn in there to make sure they don't upload the wrong version when they're done. Okay, and then publish, you can, it's just if you want to automatically publish to YouTube, Vimeo, or Creative Cloud or something. Captions, obviously closed captions, multiplexer, just ignore this. You will almost never use this. It's only for very unusual circumstances, like you're encoding a video just for the PSP, or something like that, or an iPod. Generally just leave that. Leave audio the same way it is. These are all great settings. You might be tempted to change the bitrate, to put the bitrate lower, but because you think you'll save space. Technically, you will save space, but it will be really insignificant the amount of space you save. So just leave all of these on the defaults. Okay, here we go to video. This is where all the magic happens. First thing here is this match source button. This is super cool. Oh, by the way, you see when I hover over that, it gives me a nice little description of what this does. And look at those; they're really helpful. They're actually quite good. But what this does, if I hit that, it's going to match all these values as far as it can to the values in the source video, which is generally a good idea. Remember I said earlier we noticed that was 1280 by 720 up there? Well, I hit match source and it changes it to 1920 by 1080 to give me the best quality. So if you want to change it, you uncheck and then you can change it, but I'm going to leave it checked. For frame rate here, again, you want to match the frame rate. You never want to change frame rates in your export. If you need to change frame rates for some reason, you need to go from 60 to 30 to 24, or even 60 to 30. I would highly recommend doing that in your editor or in After Effects. Don't do that here because this won't use the most advanced tools for that. It will be very simple. So you just want to use the one that comes from your source. Remember, it's right up here, 23976. Field order. So this is if you have interlaced versus progressive video. So most of the time you're going to use progressive because nowadays most people shoot progressive video. But I'll give a quick explanation of what interlaced means because this is somewhat important if you're going to deal with interlaced video. So let's say we have a frame and I'm just going to draw these lines to represent horizontal lines in the image. So let's say like this is a widescreen video and each of these lines is a row of pixels. Okay, now I'm going to draw lines in between them in green. And then each of these lines represents another horizontal line. Now, obviously, there would be many, many more lines like this. They would be very, very close together to make basically a grid, but I'm just simplifying it here. Now, if you have interlaced video, you'll see something like 60i or 30i that's interlaced. What happens is let's say we have 60i. Every 60th of a second, only half of the frame gets changed. Only one of these, either all the blue lines or all the green lines get changed to sort of like the next frame every 60th of a second. What this does is it gives you smoother motion, and compared to changing the entire frame every 60th of a second, you actually save, you cut your file size in half because you only have to store half of the information. But there is a slight knock on the image quality on that and some other artifacts and things. So generally people try to go 60p, 60 progressive if possible, or 24p or 30p, etc. It's somewhat of a relic of an older time with older TVs, and computers can actually only display progressive video. They usually are not even capable of displaying interlaced video correctly. So you definitely want to de-interlace. If you're working with interlaced video, you'll need to de-interlace it to make it progressive. And you want to do that before you get to this step. Do that with a plugin, do it in After Effects or in Premiere, and do it on you want a progressive timeline and de-interlace your interlaced footage so that when you export here, your source in the summary panel should have progressive on it, and then you just choose progressive here in your export. Aspect ratio is you probably won't be doing much besides square pixels because nowadays almost everything is square. This is sort of a relic from an older time, but I'll just give you a quick explanation of that. Back when we were using DV a lot, before HD became very popular, DV was natively a 4:3 aspect ratio, so something kind of square like this. And people wanted to shoot video that looked widescreen because widescreen was cool. It was like Hollywood, right? And so they wanted to shoot this, but their file format only could do this. And the way they got around that was by sort of squeezing in a larger frame, squishing it into a smaller, sort of a more square frame. And then that ended up with pixels that weren't square, they were squished. And then you would choose the right one depending on what type you're using. But nowadays we're usually shooting HD in a widescreen format anyway, so you just stay square. Again, if you're not sure, you'll see right here in my source 1.0. Here we have 1.0, so I know I'm matching. NTSC versus PAL, this is pretty self-explanatory. Just kind of depends on what country you're from, and usually you should hopefully know that, what country you're in. Now let's talk about profile and level. These are actually fairly simple, but a lot of people don't understand them. So H.264 has a lot of really, really complicated techniques. Hopefully you've watched my previous video and you've seen some of them. In that video, I massively simplified it. H.264 is so complicated. It's really, really cool, all the cool things it can do to squeeze video down into a small space. The problem is, when you do that, it takes a lot of processing power to sort of unsqueeze it and untangle it out into normal video again. So let's say I have an old computer, from a number of years old, and it doesn't have a very fast processor, and so it may not be fast enough to unscramble the video, to decode it in real time. So it may be really laggy or maybe stuttery because the computer just can't handle decoding it fast enough. So that's why you have profiles. Let me uncheck this here. You can see I've got three free choices here. There actually are like 20 or 30 different profiles, but most of them are very specialized. The profiles give a specification for what techniques the encoder or decoder will use to make the video smaller. Because it can get very, very, very complicated, or it can be quite simple. And if it's simple, then it takes a less powerful processor to decode it. So let's say I am the manufacturer of a smartwatch, okay? And the smartwatch, it's pretty small, maybe it's not very powerful, and it can't decode super, super highly compressed video with all these fancy techniques in real time. So I will publish a specification saying, my smartwatch can only take baseline H.264. That way, when someone is encoding for that smartwatch, they know, okay, I better use baseline. And baseline will be less efficient. The higher you go, the more efficient you will get, the better quality in a smaller space you'll get. But of course, it takes more processing power. Now, this brings up another topic I want to talk about real quick, and that's the difference between file delivery and web delivery. So versus web delivery. So the two scenarios are, let's say I'm giving a file to my client, and it's going to be uploaded to Vimeo, say, or YouTube, or let's say it's just for myself personally. I'm going to put it on Vimeo or YouTube. I'm going to be giving YouTube a file, and they're going to, I've chosen all my settings. They're going to completely recompress it, and they're going to choose their own settings, and I have no control over that. Nothing that I do when I choose my settings will have any effect on the settings that YouTube or Vimeo or whatever video sharing site chooses. So I don't have to think about the actual device that the end user is going to view the video on, because the choices I make here will be irrelevant. YouTube will make their own choices, and they're usually, YouTube and video are pretty good at making the right choices for those things. So I just want to give YouTube the highest quality, right? I want them to give them the best thing to work with, so when they compress it down, it still looks good. If I give them a low quality video and they compress it even further, then it will look even worse. But if I give them a very high quality video and they compress it, it will look good. So you generally want to give them high. Now, so that was web delivery here, okay? That was web delivery. YouTube, Vimeo, etc. I'm doing file delivery. That's when I'm giving a file to a client, and they're going to actually view it on their computer, and that's like the main purpose is they can view it on their computer, or they're going to give it to all of their customers, and they're going to view it on their computers, or something like that. In that case, then I'm actually going to give them the file that's not going to be compressed again. The choices I make here and my export are very important, because if I know that my client is using, is giving this to a lot of people with older computers, I don't want to choose high, because it may not play on those computers, and their customers are going to be unhappy. Their customers are going to be unhappy because the video is not working. But most of you probably are going to be doing mostly web delivery, which means you're going to use the high setting. And again, level is a similar idea here. Profile was a specification for the compression settings, things like the complexity of the temporal compression and a lot of other tricks. If you don't know what temporal compression is, watch my previous video, which explains that. So that was profile. Level is a similar idea, but instead of talking about the encoding techniques, it just talks about the resolution, like 1920 by 1080 or 1280 by 720, the resolution and the bit rate. How many bits are used every second, like how much data every second is used to encode the video. So if you choose a level, let's say it's a super low level like 2, you can see way up here, my height and width jumped all the way down to 416 by 234. So level 2 is a specification that says you can't go any higher than this value. And again, if you think about like the smartwatch example, let's say the smartwatch has a small screen. Well, the manufacturer may just say, well, we can't handle video that's any bigger than this. So we just say, if you want to give us video, use level 2, and might say use baseline profile. And that way it's very, very quick and easy way for us to make sure that the video will play. And of course you can go up higher, and then if you go up to 4, then okay, 4 allows us to go all the way up to 1920 by 1080. If you're making these choices for YouTube or Vimeo, then you just want to look at their published profiles. And they actually publish great information about what the best settings are. So if you're not sure, just Google Vimeo compression settings or YouTube compression settings, and you'll find a page that's published by those companies saying what the best level and what the best profile are. And then you can just follow that. Render at maximum bit depth, I recommend that. Generally, that is a good idea. It will give you better quality colors if you're doing a lot of color correction or something like that. The only time you would not check this is if you're in a big hurry, or if you're just doing like a temporary, just to like check the edit. You don't care so much about the color fidelity, color quality, because of course this takes longer. But it's basically higher quality color, but it takes longer. So generally, I leave it checked. All right, now we have bitrate. So bitrate is just the amount of data that's encoded in the video per second. Okay, and so you can see target bitrate down here. We have Mbps, that's megabits per second. And there are 3 settings here. I'll start with CBR because that's the simplest one. CBR stands for constant bitrate. Constant bitrate. Versus variable, so variable bitrate. That means it will change throughout the video, go up and down, versus constant means the bitrate will stay the same. I think I'll start by explaining 2-pass VBR. So VBR means variable bitrate, and so what you do is you set an average. It calls it target, but really this is sort of an average. So I want my average bitrate to be 10 megabits per second, okay? And then you can set a maximum saying, well, if you need a lot more for a certain scene, for a certain shot, you can go all the way up to 20. And no higher than that, you can go up to 20. So the 2-pass VBR is it'll take 1 pass through the video, and it's just going to scan through the whole video, going all the way through, and it's going to say, okay, this is a fairly complex shot, this is an easier shot, there's more motion in this shot, there's less motion in this shot, and it determines how much data each shot needs, okay? And if you watch my previous video, you'll understand why certain shots, certain types of shot can be compressed with much less data, and some need much more data. So it goes all the way through, and it calculates, okay, this shot we need X megabits per second, this shot we need Y megabits per second. And then for the second pass, it goes through and actually encodes using that analysis that it created the first time. And that can be really, really efficient, because what happens is you have this shot over here that takes very little data, so it saves its data for the parts that need more, and that way the trickier parts to compress, the more the sort of like the more motion, the more detail, more complexity, those get a lot of data, so they look really great. And the ones that are very simple, like this, they look great too, because you don't need a lot of data to compress them. Now, a CBR is just going to use the same data rate the whole time. Okay, so it'll give we set our target bit rate to 10, and this shot will get 10 megabits per second, and so will the most complicated shot get 10. Whereas if we had the VBR 2-pass over here, then the most complicated shot can get 20, and so it'll look a lot better. And the simple shot will look just as good, because it'll only get maybe 5 or even 4 or 5 megabits per second, but it only needs 4 or 5. And so when you had the constant bit rate at 10, it doesn't actually look any better here. It looks the same, whereas the complicated scenes look worse on the CBR, because they're only getting 10 megabits per second when they need, say, 20. Okay. The only time when a CBR will look as good as a VBR is when you have a video that's just the same thing the whole way through. Like the perfect example of that, if you're recording a lecture, okay, you have your camera set up and you just hit record and it just sits there the whole lecture. the complexity of the shot is not changing from moment to moment, so you don't need to be tweaking the bitrate up and down all the time. You can just leave it the same, and that'll look just as good. But the VBR will never look worse than the CBR. It'll often look better. It'll sometimes look the same, but it'll never look worse. So I pretty much always use VBR. The downside, of course, is that VBR will take a little longer, okay? Because it has to do those passes, right? But the CBR will never look better. So if you have time, just use the VBR, you know. Now, so I explained the VBR 2 pass. The VBR 1 pass is a simpler version. Instead of going through and doing its analysis first, it just starts encoding from the beginning. So it looks at the frame and now analyzes it and says, okay, I think about this much, this many bits to compress this many bits to compress that, and it goes along, but it doesn't know what's coming up. It only knows what it's seen in the past. And as you can imagine, that's a big disadvantage. So let's imagine we have a film that's a video. The first half of it is a super intense chase scene, okay? And it needs a lot of data to compress that. And the second half is a really slow, quiet montage, not a lot happening. You know, it's kind of sepia tone, there's not a lot of contrast, so it needs very little bits to compress that. So the 2-pass VBR would scan the whole video and realize, oh, wow, the second half is super easy to compress. So it might use 3/4 of its bits, 3/4 of its data on the first half, because it knows that's much more complicated. Or it might even use like 4/5. It might use most of its data on the first half. And that'll be really efficient, because the second half doesn't need much data. If you compress that same video with a 1-pass VBR, and it starts chugging along and it says, oh, okay, this needs a lot of data, this chase scene needs a lot of data, and it goes along. But when it gets to the halfway point, it doesn't know what's coming up here. So for all it knows, it might be a chase scene the whole way through. So it can only use about half of its data at this point, you see, because if it uses 3/4 or 4/5 of its data here, and it's a chase scene the whole way through, then the chase scene will look terrible in the second half. And because it doesn't know what's coming up, it can only budget half of its data for half of the video. So you might end up with that chase scene getting through the chase scene only using half of your data, when really you should have used 3/4, 4/5 of your data. So the VBR 2 pass is significantly better in many cases than the VBR 1 pass. Okay, so that's bitrate. Now the way that you make a choice about where to set the bitrate, again, depends on whether you're doing file delivery or web delivery. So if you're doing web delivery, this file is going to get compressed again, okay? And so really what you want to do is you want to set the qualities basically the highest that you can manage so that the file is not too big for you to upload, right? You want something pretty high. Now, of course, do it within reason. Going all the way up to 50 megabits per second really is not going to be that much better than, say, 20 megabits per second. But 20 megabits might be a lot better than 4 megabits. And it really just kind of depends on what type of video you have and what the dimensions are of the video and how complex the video is. Again, if it's a screen capture like this is right now, this video, I don't know what I'm going to compress it at, but I'll probably compress it way down here at like 5 or something, and it will look just as good as 50 because it's a screen capture. It doesn't have a lot of motion. It doesn't need a lot of data. Whereas if I was doing, again, the cliche example is a chase scene, then I want to set it higher. And if you want to get a good sort of feeling for what the guidelines are, I recommend looking at the websites for YouTube and Vimeo and places like that, because they will give good sort of guidelines. They will publish, say, if you have a 1920 by 1080 video, we recommend a range of X to Y bitrate, and then you can decide where in that range or you want to be based on how complex your video is. Generally speaking, the higher the better, right? So generally try to go higher if your upload bandwidth can handle it. And then your maximum bitrate, again, if you're going to YouTube or Vimeo, then you can set it pretty high, and then and YouTube and Vimeo will be able to handle it. Now, that was all for web delivery, okay? If you're doing like a file delivery, then you have to think about, okay, how big of a file size do I want to give to my client? Obviously, you can go super high, but you don't want to your client might not be able to handle a 1.5 gigabyte file. And again, this is a 5-minute video, 1.5 gigabytes. If this were an hour-long video, that would be huge and ridiculously huge. So in that case, you might want to ask your client how big of a file do you want to handle. You might want even render out a couple different versions at different bit rates and just say, hey, here's two files. One of them's a higher quality, but it's a larger file, and another one's lower quality, but it's a smaller file, and then they can decide what they want to do themselves. Okay, the last setting is keyframe distance. To understand that, you really have to have watched my other video, my previous video where I talk about temporal compression, what a GOP is, a group of pictures. And so if you haven't watched that, do watch it, but I'll give you a quick summary. What happens is each frame in H.264 is calculated based on the previous frames, okay? So the first frame will record the entire picture, and then the second frame will just record the difference between this picture and that picture, and the third frame will record the difference between this picture and that picture, and so on. And it will make sort of a chain, and they call this a GOP, or a group of pictures. It'll go on and on. And this keyframe distance here is the length of this chain before you just sort of start over with a new frame that's not referencing any previous frames. Now, I really recommend not checking this. I recommend letting Premiere choose what it thinks the best keyframe distance is going to be, especially if you do something like a VBR2 pass. Then it can look through and figure out, okay, we've got a lot of, not a lot of motion in this video, so we can set a pretty long GOP, pretty long keyframe distance, and then it'll be more efficient, and it will save space and will allow you to use your codec more effectively. And if it's not if it's not smooth and simple, then it will set the keyframe distance to be much smaller. Now, you may think that you should just set this down to 1, all the way down to 1, because that will essentially remove temporal compression, because every frame will be its own keyframe, its own self-contained encoded frame, not referencing previous or future frames. So you're basically sort of disabling this. This is not actually a good idea most of the time, and I'll explain why. So if you set this keyframe distance to 1 and you disable temporal compression, you're actually going to have a lower quality video in the end in most circumstances, because temporal compression is very efficient. Having a long GOP is actually a great way to save space. And if you have a specified bit rate, like say I've specified 11 megabits per second, I have approximately 487 megabytes to work with to compress this video. And that's more or less a constant amount. I'm going to use 487 megabytes. If I have a long GOP codec, I can actually spend a lot more information on a lot more data on this first frame, and it will look a lot better, because I'm not spending a full frame's worth of information on this frame and this frame and this frame. I'm only spending a fraction of the information, which means I've saved that data and I can add it to this frame. So I'm making better use of the data I have to work with by taking advantage of long GOP compression, which is very efficient and will make my image look better. Now, the reason why some people will advocate going to no long GOP compression or setting the keyframe distance to 1 is because there sometimes are some artifacts, some slight image problems that will appear because of the long GOP compression. That's why people try to avoid it as a capture codec. And so you can actually set the keyframe distance to 1, disabling long GOP compression, only if you have a lot of data to work with. You have a very high bit rate. That will allow you to compress every frame individually with no reference frames, and you will have enough data that every frame will actually look good. But you have to make sure you have that high of a bit rate, which will probably be a lot higher than normal, because you'll have to use a lot more data because you're losing the huge advantage of long GOP compression. So you should do some tests. Make sure that when you set this, if you set keyframe distance to 1, you may actually be taking your image quality down, not up. And of course, bear in mind that if you upload this to YouTube or Vimeo, well, they're going to encode it into a long GOP codec, whether you like it or not, and there's not anything you can do about it. Okay, so that finishes up all of our video codec settings. All we have left is this section at the bottom here, and one of them is maximum render quality. So this is mainly for scaling. So if you're doing some sort of scaling in your timeline, or up here when we looked at the height and width, if you're changing that, then you definitely want to have this checked. If you're not doing any scaling, then it doesn't really matter, but it's not really going to hurt you either, so I definitely recommend putting it on all the time. then there's use frame blending. This is, again, if you're changing like the speed of a clip, if you're speeding up or speeding down, or if you are changing the frame rate, this will allow you to sort of blend frames together to make it more smooth, but it won't be a perfect result. You can't really get great quality video sped up or sped down by frame blending. So if you're going to do something like that, I really recommend using a plugin or using After Effects, because those programs can do a much better job at this. So you can check it if you want to, but hopefully it will never be relevant, because you're not going to be changing speeds of things right on your timeline, because usually you won't get the greatest quality whether or not you check that. And with that, we are done. That covers everything I want to talk about, all these details. Hopefully you understand this a lot better now. And feel free to add comments if I didn't explain something well or something you're not sure about. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to stay on top of what I'm doing, new videos coming out, check out my Facebook page, facebook.com/DavidKongFilm, or my website, davidkong.net. And I will see you next time.